Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to IFFGD's new Research Award winner series titled Where Are They Now? This program was not only designed for IFFGD to acknowledge our 30th anniversary year, but to also provide us an opportunity to reconnect with some of our past Research Award winners. And so today we actually have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Emeran, who won the IFFGD Research Award in 2009 for Senior Investigator in Basic Science. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Meyer. Can you briefly explain to us what you're doing currently and where you're located?
Well, thanks first of all for giving me the opportunity to talk about this here. I'm obviously very indebted to the IFFGD for support over decades, I could say I probably wouldn't be where I am today without that support. So where I am today and have been for the past 30 years or so is in the Division of Digestive Diseases at UCLA. I'm currently a distinguished research professor in medicine, physiology, and psychiatry. And in this position, I have pursued really a career-long interest in clinical, basic, and translational aspects of brain-gut interactions.
Nice. Thank you so much for giving us a little bit of background of what you do. And I know that you kind of touched on it a little bit there, but how do you feel that winning the IFFGD Research Award may have helped influence your career?
Well, I think it was not sort of the direct influence of the actual award. This was a recognition of the close interactions that I've had during my career with IFFGD and with Nancy, and who has, which has enabled us to successfully compete for grants at the NIH. I mean, this is clearly an area where the NIH was not always particularly interested in funding research, and IFFGD has helped through direct lobbying in DC. That we were able to get some of our biggest awards, the Center Grant for studying sex-related differences in brain-gut interactions and in IBS. So I think the award was in some ways a recognition of a long-standing close interaction and the support that I've been getting over the decades, really, from this amazing organization.
Yeah, no. And are you currently still involved in research? And if so, kind of can you explain to us what topics you might be focused on and working towards?
Yes, so it's a very interesting development that, for many years, in the early parts of my career, this was really a struggle. There were only a few of us who recognized the important role of the brain, and the brain-gut interactions in the pathophysiology and the symptom generation in IBS. And that has, dramatically changed about, I would say, I don't know if it's exactly the number of years, but about, 5-7 years ago, when microbiome science came on the scene, exploded on the scene, fascinated not only the lay public, but also many investigators, clinicians, and also funding agencies. So with the inclusion of the microbiome in the brain-gut axis, now called, the brain-gut microbiome system, all of a sudden there was tremendous interest, not just in GI and in GI funding organizations, but particularly interesting to me in psychiatry, in neurology, in diseases that we would not have even dreamed, even 10 years ago, that the microbiome, like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and autism spectrum, that the brain-gut axis would play a crucial role. And so what has happened with my research, we have been fortunate to continue our NIH funding in my core interest. So we're in the fourth funding cycle now um, by the ORWH and NIDDK of our center, of our SCORE center, looking at sex as a biological variable in brain-gut microbiome interactions. But also, I've been able, in collaborations with either junior investigators or other investigators at UCLA or outside of UCLA, to get involved with NIH funding in other areas. As I mentioned, autism spectrum, Parkinson's disease, and cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease. So what has happened to me, I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing for IFFGD, that before it was 100% focused on functional GI disorders and IBS. The last 7 years, the brain-gut microbiome system has become the main focus, with IBS still sort of a major part of it, but it has widened because the investigative techniques that we've been using, looking at the brain, looking at the gut microbiome, and looking at behavioral parameters, are kind of the same in all these disorders. You just have to sort of adapt them, to these particular disease areas. So it's been absolutely amazing. I have to say, I could not imagine a more exciting phase of my career as it is now. And yeah, hopefully this will continue. And what has also happened, it's spawned the interest, like in our division of digestive disease at UCLA, that junior faculty members that came as fellows with a research interest have picked some of those new areas in brain-gut microbiome interactions as their career goal. So there's 2 people that are interested in Parkinson's disease, and so inflammatory bowel disease, I mentioned it before, is another one of those that has become a brain-gut microbiome disorder, where we don't no longer say it's just a T-cell abnormality. It's really a systems problem where multiple components of the system are involved. So we have, 2 junior investigators who have gone into that area, and we're now very close to establishing this UCLA brain-gut microbiome center, which will include, this wide range of diseases, with the brain-gut axis at the core of this. So yeah, a lot of very exciting things. And I often think back, on the times of struggle, or without IFFGD, I don't know, maybe at some point I would have just given up and say, in this area you just cannot get NIH funding, you cannot build a career. So I'm glad, it went the way it did.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of what you said about research and how it's broadening and it's growing. It started as this smaller category, but I think the more researchers ask questions, the more we learn about specific topics, and the more understanding we can gain about digestive disorders and other conditions. So what do you hope to gain from some of these research studies that you're currently involved in? And how do you hope that these studies might help us better understand GI disorders for adults and children?
Well, I think to really understand, there's obviously a wide range of GI disorders that IFFGD now, IFFGD is also, I don't need to tell you that, but has expanded its scope from really being primarily interested in IBS to, GI disorders now in general. And there's obviously differences. Some disorders, this brain-gut microbiome system is not that crucial. In some, the microbiome is not essential. I think what is important is the realization or the acceptance that the brain is an essential part of these disorders. And you know, in our research, we started focusing on this concept of increased perception or visceral hypersensitivity as a key component. And we've worked on this and still working on this topic. And we believe that the brain plays a key role in amplifying these sensory signals that come from the gut, and then has a lot of consequences in terms of symptom generation and behavioral responses. And I think the impact of this is significant because, so we see on the one side that cognitive behavioral therapy is now being fully accepted as a treatment. It will get more accepted even with with online delivery of this modality, hypnosis, but I'm particularly interested in cognitive behavioral therapy. That no longer is dependent if you have a specially trained therapist in your neighborhood, but anybody can sign up for that and can do it online. I think that will really revolutionize our approach to brain gut disorders, because then you can apply it not just to IBS patients but also IBD patients, to children. It has no side effects. It has been reduced in length, so CBT is no longer a month-long therapy, expensive, dependent on a few specialized therapists. But any physician will be able to write a prescription, sometimes not as the only therapy. So I think that's another thing that has come out of my conceptualization of the disorders. Because there's multiple components from the brain, the gut, enteric nervous system, and the microbes, and food, obviously, that is a main influence on this brain-gut microbiome system, that you have to target your therapy at multiple targets. So our earlier approach, that I pursued for quite many years with the support of the pharmaceutical industry, that you would like to identify a particular receptor or receptor subtype and target this one little part of the complex system, and think that you would get clinically relevant results. That approach worked in mouse models. You could block just about any kind of IBS-like symptoms in mouse models, but it never really worked fully in humans. And it's because in humans we have these multiple components that contribute to these diseases. So I think that realization, this multi-component therapy, interdisciplinary interactions in the design of a treatment strategy between specially trained psychologists and physicians and dietitians. That has to already become a reality, certainly in our center at UCLA, and as far as I know, in quite a few other places. I'm not sure if the pharmaceutical industry has completely accepted that model. It's obviously not as suitable to then coming up with a pill that blocks the receptor. But I don't think there's any way back. There's there's even as you know, so this psychogastroenterology subspecialty now, within GI. So it kind of feels good to have been one of the pioneers. I'm not, from the early days on, Dr. Rossman was always on the same wavelength, but now it's sort of spread to a lot of young clinicians and investigators. So I think that to me is really the most satisfying thing to see, that it did have an impact on the field.
Yeah. And I think not only did it have an impact on some of the younger investigators who are coming up, but I think that also it broadened the understanding of GI conditions in a whole, and it really gave physicians and other healthcare providers an opportunity to find ways to better help some of their patients. So what other research studies might you consider being your most successful research study, or one that you really remember being involved in?
Well, I mean, there was, about, I don't know exactly the timing, but something like 15, possibly 20 years ago, where we had a series of really competent GI fellows, Tony Lembo, Howard Mertz, who have gone on to have their own, impressive careers. And so we were a group of people that published a series of studies. I think they were pivotal in terms of establishing this concept of increased perception and visceral hypersensitivity as a key component of functional GI disorders. I mean, I like the term, this is something, another sort of sense of accomplishment, that the name has been changed, or is in the process of being changed, from functional to brain-gut disorders of brain-gut interactions. So we've tried to do this for a long time, and it's really satisfying to see that that has happened, or is happening. But anyway, so this work to establish that IBS is not just a motility disorder, and that you could explain all the symptoms by changes in motility, but rather that it has a very important component of affected individuals just being more sensitive, not just to their gut, but also to environmental stimuli. So we started with the gut, but in the meantime, I think we perceived this as a more generalized increased reactivity of the brain to external and internal stimuli. And that also explains, and this is part of this exciting body of knowledge that's sort of emerged from this, that now we know there's many of these overlapping conditions. There's many other chronic pain disorders that are more prevalent in IBS patients. We also know something why these disorders are more are not only more common in women, which is not that dramatic, the difference, but have greater behavioral consequences in women, because the female brain responds differently to this hypersensitivity. And I would say, so this is the other part. We've been funded for more than 15 years now by Office of Research of Women's Health and the NIDDK on studying the role of sex as a biological variable. And that has had a major impact as well, I would say. I consider that another key accomplishment, because now, as part of this effort, if you submit an NIH grant, you have to address, that you study women. If you don't study women, you have to have a very good reason why in your particular study you don't. And this concept, like all the people that have worked with us or trained with us, it's deeply ingrained that any grant, any research is always based on acknowledging or looking at the sex-related differences. And there's still work to be done now. In the latest iteration of this grant, center grant, we're looking also at the microbiome. How estrogen and estrogen metabolites affect the microbiome. So I would say the visceral hypersensitivity, the sex differences, and maybe add the third thing. For a long time, we have been interested in applying the same kind of investigative techniques to inflammatory bowel disease. And again, it was a situation not that long ago that the field would try to explain, the leading researchers would explain the IBD pathophysiology based on abnormalities in the T cell receptor and then in genetics. And it's been extremely rewarding for me to have been invited by the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation to become part of a commission that developed a white paper with the guidelines for research on environmental triggers. So all of a sudden, really based on, and it's a kind of a similar story as what happened with IFFGD, patients demanded that the research portfolio should be expanded because what they experienced, that stress and emotions and food played a big role in the symptoms, and the research was not funded in that direction. So having been part of that effort and being one of the first recipient of one of their big grants on the role of stress in clinical flares in ulcerative colitis, well, we use the same kind of approach, this brain, gut, behavioral, microbiome assessment, and then looking at correlations and looking at interactions of these parameters with machine learning approaches. So that's been another really, and just like with CBT, I mean, this is now becoming mainstream. It's sort of, many of these things have taken almost 40 years of being in this field to see now that the ideas that we had 35 years ago are really happening. So I couldn't be more excited at this stage of my career, because all of this will have implications for therapy for the patients. Many of these patients have felt they've been inadequately treated. Yeah, I mean, they get some relief from in all these areas. So the patients get some relief from medications, but it's not the satisfaction that they expect that somebody else would expect from a treatment. And I think that will change by adding that, that integrative brain-gut component to the pathophysiology.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely tremendous. And I think that that's so much that you've been involved in yourself, and had a hand in also bringing in the patient voice in some of these research studies. And so, in part of that, what would you say would be some of your biggest acknowledgements? I know you mentioned that you've received some other NIH grants, but what other acknowledgements have you received since winning the IFFGD Research Award?
Yes, as you say, I mean, NIH has been, particularly NIDDK, Dr. Frank Hamilton, I owe him a lot of a lot of gratitude to be supportive throughout the years, both in terms of my continuous R1 funding, but also the funding of our center grant. We're just sort of in a corner piece of building our center and allowing us to expand. I was going to mention a couple of awards that are particularly meaningful to me. One is from the German Society of Digestive Disorders, their most prestigious award, the Ismar Boas Award. So he was considered the founder of German gastroenterology, and I have to admit, I did not know who that man was until I was contacted that I was selected for this award. But then I read up on him and his influence and his importance in German gastroenterology, and it was a deep honor to get this award. Another one was from the American Psychosomatic Society. The highest award, which was really a recognition. I mean, the American Psychosomatic Society obviously, has always included the nervous system and the brain in their disease models, and I've interacted with them over the years, and so this has been another really special recognition. Then also from the DDW, their mentor award, which was nice because it really, well, this was nice for a couple of reasons. One is of all my trainees, there was one junior faculty member, Dr. Annie Gupta, who actually came up with this idea to nominate for this award, and that really, moved me a lot that she would do that. And then by putting this together, you have to put together like all the people that you have touched in some way or another, in mentoring and training and recruiting. And it was a pretty impressive list that you kind of forget, how many people were affected by this. And yeah, so that also very satisfying recognition of some of the things that I've done. Yeah, I would say these 3 awards for me have been really important. I mean, there were smaller other things, but I mean, this to me was sort of the main ones.
Yeah, and I think it actually touches on how many people you've touched also in some of your research. And then also just not only you're being recognized in the US, but you're also being recognized by other doctors, other German doctors as well. And I think that that is phenomenal. And it is a testament to your involvement in research and your passion behind it. And speaking of passion, what specifically do you enjoy the most about being a researcher and why?
Well, I would have to say I've always enjoyed to be a researcher and a clinician. So I love to see patients. I would not be happy. I had phases in my career where, I was almost 100% or 75% clinical, which was okay for a while, but it didn't satisfy my curiosity and my inquisitive mind to really, when I see these patients, I know why do they have the symptoms. So being able to do both for most of my career has been very satisfying. And I think it has been good for the patients as well, because I could always directly tell them the models that have come out of our research, and being with the patients would always fertilize our research effort, always. I mean, this is, where many other researchers labeled patients' comments as hysterical or crazy, or we've always taken their symptom descriptions as literal, because I mean that's their experience. And if I had to identify one way that has helped me pursue my career, is listening to the patients and translating that into research questions and hypotheses. So yeah, I'm still one of those dinosaurs that have been doing the triple threat, and that has been really exciting. I mean, to be able to train people at the same time, being the clinician, getting a reward from patients and information, and then inspiring the research efforts. It's a great model, which is getting more and more difficult, because obviously, in order to be competitive, you have to be almost 100% research. In order to generate your revenue, your salary, you have to be almost 100% clinical. Yeah, I would say, I mean, I should mention one thing that's also been a really important component. So we talked about the mentoring and informing patients, but then, about 4.5 years ago, I had this opportunity, was invited by a publisher to publish a book on the mind-gut connection, which is something. To write a book has been on my mind. I just recently cleaned up my office and I found a handwritten, not diary, but a handwritten sort of document from, I would say, unfortunately, there's no date on it, but probably from 30 years ago, where I outlined pretty much the same idea that I used for this, for this book 30 years later. So this has sort of been in my mind, and I always wanted to do it. But then I was invited by a publisher to do this. Was a painful process. This was for the lay public and for patients, and then something very interesting happened, that it was really well received. It took a while. It's still, after 4.5 years, a #1 bestseller in neuropsychology and behavioral neuroscience, and #2 in gastroenterology. And so that has completely changed my practice. So before, I would get referrals from primary care physicians or other gastroenterologists. So now what has happened, almost every patient comes with a copy of the book, and they either say, "I'm patient so-and-so in your book," because there are a lot of patient anecdotes in it, or they don't even want a formal consultation. They want an explanation of some section in this book, and that's why they come to the office. So it's dramatically changed this, and I think it's also given, from the feedback that I received, a lot of patients a relief of being misunderstood and being blamed by by doctors and by people around them to imagine their symptoms and not knowing what they really have. And yeah, so this has sort of been, and I've just finished my second book, so it will come out in early June. This has sort of become, I mean, it's always been a passion, but now I can realize it's another area that, in addition to the triple threat, that I would say is become really important. And I'm planning to pursue this as much as I can to target the larger public, with not just my colleagues, not just the patients, but really the public in general, with changing their mindset about these disorders.
Yeah, and I think just everything that you've said, I think the main thing here about why you enjoy it that I took is really that not only being a clinician, but also being a researcher provides you with the opportunity to really answer the questions that your patients have. And I think that is a tremendous outlook to have as a researcher, because really and truly, researching is to gain a better understanding about things. And what's better to understand than the questions that people and patients have when they come to your office. So that I really like that statement, and I thank you for all of the research that you have done. And talking about some of the research that you've done in the past and some of the things that you're currently doing, what are you noticing might be some of the gap needs to better understand some of these GI conditions that adults and children actually suffer from?
So the gaps in our knowledge, so I would say it's really to fill in the details. I think, I mean, I personally have the impression, and I may be totally wrong, I've been wrong many times in my career, but that's being a scientist. You have a hypothesis, and then you do studies, and then we either reject the hypothesis, and you have to you have to be willing and humble enough to say, okay, it was the wrong hypothesis. So the prediction, that I would say, we know the basic outline, the basic architecture of these disorders pretty well now, and we know things that have therapeutic benefit. And I would say mainly it's therapies targeted at the brain, more the behavioral therapies than the pharmacological therapies. And we know therapies targeted at the gut. Obviously, there's some components of increased that influence bowel habits, increased secretion, altered motility. But then diet, has become another sort of main area that, with the microbiome interest, is an essential part. So I would say the general outline and the general therapies we know today. And it needs to be seen if these multidisciplinary therapies or therapeutic approach is being implemented with the help of online behavioral treatments and well-trained dietitians that really have a deep understanding of the microbiome and the food. I think once that happens, I think we have made a very big step forward in terms of effective treatments. Like all of our papers always start with this sentence, one of the most common group of disorders, but inadequately treated. Well, I think we may actually be able, just based on what we know today, fairly adequately treat maybe the majority of patients. If the physician is well trained, and there's this process going on now, I would say that there's a different kind of training today. You no longer trained that a smooth muscle cell explains IBS or that a T cell receptor explains IBD. And but so what are the gaps? I mean, the gaps are, we're only at the beginning of understanding the microbiome science. And there are people, in microbiome science is driven by the excitement to identify particular microbes, particular metabolites that can generate intellectual property, and the pharmaceutical industry is interested. That may happen for some disorders, that you have genetically engineered microbes or a cocktail of microbes that you do something like a virtual fecal transplant. So there are some of these techniques that are currently dependent on better understanding of the microbiome science. There's also, we're further along with understanding the brain, but brain science is still, an evolving field, and particularly emotional neuroscience. So there will be more specific things coming out that will give us. So I mean, just give you one example. We've been interested for a long time in this increased stress responsiveness of the brain in IBS patients. And so we're still pursuing this increased stress perception, that somehow the brain reacts or turns on the stress response at a lower threshold than in a patient than in somebody who doesn't have that disease. And that then triggers a downstream cascade of increased autonomic system activity. And so we don't know exactly really how that increased stress responsiveness is regulated. We were interested years ago in a particular neurotransmitter, corticotropin releasing factor, and its specific receptor, CRF1 receptor. And everybody in the field, in psychiatry and GI, thought this is going to be the miracle drug of the century to block that receptor or attenuate it. And miraculously, it didn't happen. It happened in all animal models and even in non-human primates, but it didn't work in humans. So the big question is, so this was never answered, why that didn't work in humans. And I still think the concept, if you had a drug that did that to turn down the dial, the stress responsiveness, in addition to these other things we talked about, the diet and the behavioral therapies, and I think that would be the biggest breakthrough. My guess is sooner or later this will happen. The pharmaceutical industry will go back to their shelves where they have all these antagonists, and somebody will figure out why this didn't work and then come up with a solution. I may be naive about this, but I've spent probably 10 years of my career looking at this mechanism. Worked very closely with a colleague at UCLA, Yvette Taché, who was the main person driving the animal research in this area. And both of us feel that this is not the end of the story. So at the brain level, I think that's a big gap. At the gut level, it's the microbiome. We know a lot about the enteric nervous system. I don't think there's going to be any black swans or any huge surprises that we have not sort of really, looked at closely and understood. But yeah, if you ask me in 10 years from now, how will the field have changed? I think we'll have much more satisfying treatment algorithms. We will need much fewer diagnostic evaluations because you can predict much more accurately who has functional disease and which IBD patient needs a behavioral component to their treatment and who doesn't. So there will be, dramatic improvement of clinical care of patients.
Yeah. And I think that with so many researchers being involved, just like you are, and just taking some of those questions that many patients have and taking the questions that even doctors have, and just finding and fulfilling those gap needs and just finding an answer to some of those things. I think that that's definitely a start. And just thank you again for all of what you've done in the field of research for the GI community. I think that just going through some of your acknowledgements and things that you're still involved in is a testament to the type of researcher and doctor that you are. You care a lot about your patients. So we just want to say thank you for your support to the patient community with that.
Yeah, and I'd like to say thank you, to all the people at the IFFGD, particularly Nancy and Bill Norton, who've really been, is essential companions along the way of this process. And so I hope the IFFGD will continue to thrive and play this catalytic role, for many young investigators. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to acknowledge them, because it's been remarkable.
Yeah. And thank you to everyone who listened to our new series on the Research Award winners titled Where Are They Now? So thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Dr. Meyer.